Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sounds of Science, a series of podcasts hosted by EUCOPE, the European trade body representing small and mid sized companies active in health technologies. This is Stefano Romanelli, and I am Senior Government Affairs Manager at EUCOPE. Today, we are diving into a special topic EUCOPE's high level letter to the leaders of the EU institutions, outlining the steps needed to build a more competitive and attractive pharmaceutical ecosystem in the EU. You can read the letter in detail on our website. Before moving forward, we'd like to kindly ask you to click on the subscribe button for our podcast and follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date on all of the latest news and initiatives within the world of European life sciences. In today's episode, we will discuss the content of UCOP's high level letter to the presidents of the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council. UCOP sent this letter in September 2024 at the beginning of the new mandate to highlight the importance of creating a strong pharmaceutical landscape that allows innovative companies, especially small and mid sized ones, to thrive while ensuring the EU remains globally competitive in the pharmaceutical landscape. In this letter, that was signed by 25 UCOP members, we address a number of issues that the EU should carry out to make the Union competitive, attractive, and future proofed for the pharmaceutical ecosystem. In this episode, we will discuss this letter and what is needed for innovative pharmaceutical companies in Europe with Enrico Piccinini, Senior Vice President, EU and International Rare Diseases Chiesi Group, Toon Digneffe, Head Public Affairs and Public Policy Europe and Canada at Takeda, and Alexander Natz, Secretary General at EUCOPE. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Stefano.
Let's jump into the discussion and let's start with the main topic of this letter, the future of the pharmaceutical ecosystem in the EU. In this letter, we have stressed the importance of creating a strong incentive framework to foster innovation, especially for mid-sized companies active in the rare disease space. Both your companies, Chiesi and Takeda, who also signed this letter, operate on a global scale but maintain a strong presence in Europe. Could you share your perspective on what the EU could do to balance the need of being competitive on a global scale while providing a stable regulatory and investment environment for companies? Let me start with you, Enrico.
Yeah, thanks, Stefano. This is definitely an important call. Let me start saying very clearly that the idea of negotiating and importing innovation generated elsewhere in the world is not a sustainable option for Europe and for its citizens, and in particular for patients. Both in the Draghi report, but also in our letter as UCOP, we clearly identify the need to have a greater commitment towards innovation and consider the innovation not only a competitive advantage, but a necessity for the overall ecosystem, also in terms of strategic independence on our setting in Europe versus other economies. To remain globally competitive, and this was the call of our letter, the European pharmaceutical industry need to have a robust, incentivizing and predictable policy environment. And all this can allow the strong investment that are needed in the pharma sector to come to create innovation and to come to create a general ecosystem driven to the patient needs. It's a need to have indeed a general simplified framework. It's needed to have the right talents and to have indeed an overall ecosystem that supports this innovation. Uh, in our case, at Chiesi, for instance, we recently opened a biotech center of excellence that for us was of a key importance in the sense trying to put our part in this game and to try indeed to strengthen our capabilities both in manufacturing then in research and development, trying indeed to put something that can be useful for the general collectivity in particular, and will allow us the possibility indeed to go deep and enhance further the innovation in all our region. But now, obviously, we have to play all together. And so, what is more important now is that the policymakers need to complement the work that the companies and the society are doing to foster innovation and to attract, world-class researchers and technicians and innovators. And it's possible to do this only to have a positive ecosystem on an economical point of view. And in this part, obviously, the general framework, also in terms of European legislation, is fundamental to create this positive general ecosystem and allow us a real innovation in front of us. This it's the point that I think was stressed on the letter, the EUCOPE letter, and I'm absolutely endorsing.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Indeed, this is very agreeable. And I would ask Ton maybe also to bring the perspective from your company on this topic.
Thanks, Stefano, for the kind introduction, for having me today. Indeed, next to my role in the board of EUCOPE, I work for Takeda, a leading values-based R&D-driven global biopharmaceutical company, which is headquartered in Japan. We have an important global hub in Boston, but foremost, we have a very strong presence also in Europe, including 12 manufacturing plants across several European countries and ongoing clinical research in all major European markets. We also have numerous partnerships with small and medium-sized biotech companies to drive innovation forward. And since your first question is about the future of innovation in Europe, I think to start with, it's important that we start closing the gap with other regions globally. And we just had the installation of a new administration under President Trump in the US with a lot of ambitions. And I believe Europe also should raise its ambitions in terms of competitiveness. And inspired by the Draghi report that Enrico already referred to, we've heard the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, state some of these ambitions at the start of the new EU legislative term that you were referring to, Stefano. And I think that's a positive development. So I think we should build on that momentum of change. And as Takeda, we've also signed the EUCOPE high-level letter that was sent to the new EU administration. And let me just highlight three measures that I believe could further reinforce Europe's ecosystem and boost our competitiveness. I think the first one is the adoption of a European life science strategy, and that again should be building on the recommendations of the Draghi report, which is clearly recognizing the biopharmaceutical industry in Europe as a strategically important sector. That's the first one. I think secondly, we need to improve patient access to medicines across Europe, taking a more holistic approach. I don't think we can fix this through an innovation framework like the general pharmaceutical legislation. We need to take kind of other measures here. Also look at successful implementation of existing legislation like EU HTA and European Health Data Space to move away from this fee-for-service to a more outcomes-based healthcare system in Europe. And that, I think, will move the needle on patient access. And then last but not least, I think Enrico referred to that as well, is the role of public-private partnerships. And maybe by extension, multi-stakeholder partnerships. We all know the Innovative Health Initiative as an important public-private partnership for Europe. But I think also rare diseases is a good example where this approach is really embedded within the community, where we help tackle challenges working all together as multiple stakeholders.
Thank you, Ton. And you have touched on a lot of topics that we will deep dive in a second. But before that, I would also like to introduce Alexander and ask him to add any additional reflections, also bringing in the perspective of the companies that we represent as EUCOPE.
Thank you very much, Stefano. I mean, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this important topic. I mean, when we look at innovation especially in rare diseases, I think a lot of innovation comes from smaller companies. Just to give some examples, if you look at spinal muscular atrophy, cystic fibrosis, I mean, these have been smaller companies bringing products to European markets. And I think what is really needed here is that we are coming back to a situation where we have an industry policy, in the European Union, which focuses at mid-sized companies, not only SMEs, because many of our members are not SMEs by the definition. Many of our mid-sized companies, like let's say Chiesi, Vertex, and many innovative companies, by far exceed the SME definition. So we really need to look at what is a company model where we find those innovations, and we need to implement an industry policy to make sure that those companies have a framework that they can continue to bring their products in rare disease in orphan indications to European patients. Because maybe moving very quickly to what we have achieved over the last 20 years. I mean, we have achieved a lot in rare disease policy. We have achieved that the legislation has actually worked. It has worked that we get orphan medicine and products in many important indications and diseases to European patients. We have a very robust regulatory system with an agency in Amsterdam, which is competitive, which is looked at from various other agencies as a partner in regulatory science, in regulatory processes. So the European Medicines Agency is probably a very good example of what Europe can achieve. We have many of those products, but as Toon mentioned, we have challenges with access. We have challenges in Europe with 27 different systems which make their own decisions about access to innovative medicines, which sometimes have very innovative policies and sometimes have very negative policies for innovation. So we really need to look at the pricing and reimbursement setting in Europe to make sure that we're staying competitive from the global level. Maybe the European Health Technology Assessment, which just entered into force some days ago, is a key factor in that. That we're having a one-stop shop, or at least the start of a one-stop shop in Brussels, in the European Union, for national pricing and reimbursement decisions. So that's maybe an opportunity as well here. But I also would like to mention that we had expected more from the clinical trial regulation. I mean, when that was passed 10 years ago, we had expected that multi-centric clinical trials were quicker to be established in the European Union. And instead of that, we've seen a decline in clinical trials. So that's really not an example where we have not seen a lot of improvement over the last 10 years. So that is very important, because to finish up with a positive note, we have a lot of science in the universities in the European Union. We have some of the best universities around the world in Europe, and I think we should harvest that know-how, and we need to make sure that we bring it. That we take it in the hands of the companies to make sure that these European innovations, if I may call them that way, would also be available to European patients. So a lot to do in terms of patient access. I think a lot to build on in terms of regulatory policy, and we will see the general pharmaceutical legislation looking into this.
Thank you, Alexander. And your last point liaises us very well to the next topic that we want to discuss today. And it's indeed the revision of the pharmaceutical legislation, which is ongoing, and it's a key milestone for the pharmaceutical industry. And I would like to ask you, and maybe starting with Toon, how do you see the proposed changes impacting the ability of your companies to continue delivering innovation in Europe, especially in the area of orphans and rare diseases?
Thanks, Stefano. And I think in addition to the points that were already raised and that were also reflected in the high-level letter, I maybe wanted to come back to 3 key recommendations from the FDI investor report that was commissioned by EUCOPE and that we launched end of last year. I think a first recommendation, I think it comes back to what Alexander was alluding to the European Medicines Agency in Amsterdam, which is well respected. The first recommendation is that we also need these fast regulatory processes that allow for early advice. And I think it's critical we have a very transparent and speedy regulatory process where we can have that early engagement and have feedback and appropriate staffing, also an expertise within that agency in Amsterdam. If we look now at the European Commission proposal, I think there's some positive developments with the shortening of these timelines. I think that's definitely a positive development that we welcome. But there's still some challenges in terms of, do we have the appropriate support, staffing, expertise, like we currently have it, for example, with the Committee of Orphan Medicinal Products, and how will this kind of be done moving forward? So there's still some outstanding questions on that first point about the need for fast regulatory processes. A second point that was highlighted in the report was the need for better access to funding in Europe. And whereas Europe is strong in science, and the topic of this podcast is Sounds of Science, more specifically, Europe was very strong in early scientific research. But compared to the US, there's limited availability and access to capital in Europe. And this makes it often difficult to raise enough capital to move to the more expensive phase 2 and 3 trials that you need to bring a new therapy to markets. So I think here Europe also needs to be doing better. And then a third recommendation from the report was the need to reduce, and this was a very strong message coming from the investors that were interviewed, we need to reduce unpredictability in early stage decision making. And right now, the decisions in the Commission proposal, as we have it in front of us, about increasing incentives like regulatory data protection or for market exclusivity, they will only be made at a later stage and are made based on a number of additional factors that add complexity. So I think it's therefore important that we reduce that complexity and that we maintain a very strong base case of incentives as we have it today with the 8 years of regulatory data protection and the 10 years of orphan market exclusivity.
Thank you, Toon. This is very clear and also important that you mentioned this report that we have worked on as EUCOPE, which brings some interesting insights also from the investor's perspective. Enrico, what do you see as the main challenges and opportunities as part of this revision, also from your side?
Yeah, let me leverage because I fully agree on the point that has been done by Don and by Alexander. Surely, the last period in Europe with the orphan drug legislation since 20 years, there has been very positive things. If you think, for example, to the increase of the orphan drugs that have been approved and they are indeed available on the market, definitely was a plus. On the capital availability in Europe, this is another concept that will come indeed later, and I'm endorsing what was mentioned for sure. As a matter of fact, if you look about a matter of competitiveness, anyhow, what we are seeing now that almost let's say half of the product and treatment available worldwide are of a U.S. origin. And more recently, this perspective involved even what we called in the past emerging markets, speaking in particular of China or Middle East or next to come India, that obviously are taking a bigger share about R&D investment in general. What happened in the last, let's say, 20 years, because if you go back to 2002, we are seeing that the level of research and development investment in US was almost equal to the one existing in Europe. After 20 years, the level of investment in US is the double of the one existing in Europe. So it means that Europe is clearly losing competitiveness. It's growing, because we cannot say that indeed it was not growing, but it was losing progressively competitiveness versus US and even versus other economies. So when we go indeed to the European legislation, and me, I'm connected to the problem of capitals, for instance, that was mentioned before. What is important to be done to me, it's to leverage and to drive clear signals to the investors and to the companies that Europe is still in charge and Europe is still interested in that. And I'm saying this because, discussion about let's say, limitation or reduction in terms of orphan market exclusivity or indeed in regulatory data protection are signals that are totally detrimental for what it comes to an investment point of view. And in particular on rare disease and in particular on unmet medical needs. What was strange to me to see in some kind of discussion during this European legislation that basically there was an intention to make a reduction of the orphan market exclusivity apart the so-called unmet medical need that was left almost the same. So this is, to me, a little bit an unexplainable concept. If investment in that diseases were not, let's say, sustainable before, it's not just simply taking out resources from the other that automatically this one that was orphan before are becoming no more orphan. They will remain orphan and the other one will not be followed anymore. So in general, there will be a general reduction of the possibility to invest in this sense. And if you compare this and combine, this with the capital, let's say, limitation that indeed was mentioned before versus other economy, or the Europe can give straight signals to the investors, so improving the incentives, in particular for some subpopulation that can be fine, but improving the investment, improving the protection. This is a signal that will be accepted and well taken by the investors, and so maybe we can regain our share of R&D, research and development investment, and assure that in the next future the European patient will have a good therapy in the proper time and even with the proper access, because in the meantime, we have growth, the general prosperity of our economy.
Thanks, Enrico. I think it's a clear message and also a clear explanations of the issues that orphan drug developers face and the need of a strong IP framework for them. And I'm sure Alexander wants to complement a bit on this and also on other key topics that as EUCOPE we see facing in this revision of the GPL.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up that point from Enrico, it's an issue, if I may say, if the level of investment in the European Union is half of the level of investment in the pharmaceutical industry as compared to the US. That's an issue. I think we need to debate more about this. And I think in the pharma industry, we talk very much about what's the willingness to pay, and we take the payer perspective into our perspective as pharmaceutical companies, which is important, no doubt. I mean, this is a very important question. But we should also ask the question: how do we increase the level, the willingness to invest in pharmaceutical companies and to invest in the research and development in the European Union? Because that's really a question which will become very important from our perspective, and which is not so prominent in the political discussion. So we really have to look into increasing the willingness to invest in the pharmaceutical and the medtech industry. Another point I think Toon made very clear, and also we highlighted that in our letter to the European Commission. It's about predictability for industry, and this is true from wherever the company is located. Predictability is key, and when I look at what we're doing in terms of like modulating both the regulatory data protection and orphan exclusivity, we're putting so many ifs into the legislation. If there is a comparative clinical trial, I might get 6 months on top of what is already lowered, as Enrico has rightfully said. If that there is a comparative clinical trial, maybe 6 months on top. If there is a launch in all the member states, which is so hard to define, we had long discussions about that political objective, which we understand is an important one. But how can we really put it in practice that it's workable from the industry perspective, that investors know early on, yes, for that product, I would get 11 years or 10 years of regulatory data protection or orphan exclusivity. Because there's another if, which is high unmet medical need, which is such a broad word and concept, which is so hard to define at the time of launch. When you're bringing a product, you don't know everything about that medicine. You will learn a lot with real-world evidence when the product is rolled out to a wider patient population. So that's another if, which is so hard to fill with life and to answer questions of investors early on, whether that higher medical need will be granted or not. So there are just too many conditions which are hard to be defined, which is a very good example, I think, about the unpredictability which we're adding to the legislation. We do very much agree with the fact that we need to modulate exclusivities, regulatory exclusivities like both RDP and orphan exclusivity, but we need to use conditions which are predictable in a way. And the last example, or the second example I would like to make for unpredictability, is about the need for interaction. I mean, we are used in regulatory processes that we can go to Amsterdam to talk to EMA to understand what the comparator is, to understand the endpoints they want to see. When we are now having that new process of the EU HTA, that interaction is not per se granted. And I think that's really a shortcoming of that process. The so-called joint scientific consultations are only a few companies are picked for those joint scientific consultations. And we really need to scale up also in this process to make sure that there is an interaction between the company and the decision maker, because that's only fair to allow the company to pick the brain, if I may call it this way, of the decision makers, to make sure that the dossier is robust and that I can actually fulfill the needs of the decision makers later on. I can only do that if I know what they want from me. And for that reason, it is so important to make sure that there are these interactions. And these are two examples, one on the IP level and the other one at the market access level, where we need to have more predictability.
Thank you, Alexander. And I think a few elements have been highlighted on what we need thinking in the GPL, but also beyond the GPL and for the future, the need of a predictability in incentives, a future-proof regulatory framework, policies that see holistically what are the needs of the companies. So thinking a bit about the future and the next steps for the policymakers in the EU, given that we are at the beginning of a new mandate, what additional actions do you think the EU should consider to support innovative companies of all sizes, including small and mid-sized ones, to address future challenges? And I would start or continue with Alexander on this.
Well, the first thing is, and we mentioned it before, I think that there needs to be a view on mid-sized companies, not only on SMEs and multinational companies. There's a lot in the middle. There's a lot in between, and this organization, which is bringing this podcast to you, is actually focusing on those mid-sized companies and innovation in those type mid-sized companies. So there's a lot in the middle, and we really need to have a look at what is the reasons for the existence of those companies, how have they been successful, what are the ingredients for those companies which need to be there. The other point I think I made clear already before, we need to look further into investment opportunities and how can we attract investors to invest in those type of companies. And I think also we need to, and Ursula von der Leyen said it in Davos, we really need to also cut red tape at the end of the day. We are adding on additional obligation, the European environmental risk assessment. We are all in favor of having good environmental rules, but we really also at some point in time have to cut red tape in order to stay competitive by not just adding additional obligations on European pharma and medtech companies, but also by, as I said, and as Ursula von der Leyen said, also by cutting red tape. I think these are three very important ingredients for the future of the pharmaceutical industry.
Thank you, Alexander. And Toon, you previously mentioned, among other actions, the EU life science strategy, but what else do you see as important steps for the future of EU competitiveness in the pharmaceutical sector and beyond?
Yeah, I maybe do want to come back to some of the elements within that EU life science strategy, because it has been announced, but there's very little known about what we should be part of it or will be part of it. So I think we should kind of be looking more based on these Draghi recommendations from that report. How can we boost Europe's competitiveness, and what can we put into that strategy to make that happen? And in order to take that holistic approach, Stefano, that you were alluding to, we need to kind of connect the dots here more between different initiatives. And there, I think the establishment of an EU Life Science Office would be a good step forward to coordinate between all these different areas of responsibilities and not just look at regulatory simplification, but also cutting really red tape. And Alexander was already alluding to that with the World Economic Forum discussions. I think this is really critical. And to cutting red tape, I would also add a better implementation of existing regulations. And we heard from Alexander there again, the EU HTA regulation. We do need a better inclusion and consultation with industry as part of that process. It is not sufficient the way it's conceived right now. So even there, in implementing existing regulations, there's more that needs to be done to really make those work.
Thank you, Toon. It's really insightful. And Enrico, you have mentioned earlier also that you have recently enhanced your investments in the Biotech Center of Excellence, and the EU Biotech Act is also among other initiatives that we expect and might come in the future, hopefully in the right way. But also, what else do you see indeed as initiatives that can support companies like yours?
Yeah, if we are talking company or mid-size level like Chiesi is, for instance, all the points that have been discussed up to now have even a greater importance than in other company probably. We have to understand and making the policymaker and the overall society clearly understand that the small but and mid-size company are really the backbones of our economy in Europe, at least, also in terms of innovation. And for them, there are, I would say, three pillars that are fundamental when you come to enhance investment. First of all, as was said very clearly by Alexander, is the predictability of our processes. And this it means regulatory processes as well as market access processes. We were discussing many times indeed about how we can enhance the accessibility of product in all 27 countries. Let's consider that indeed we have 27 different rules, in many cases unpredictable in terms of time and finalization. So as you can imagine, a company of a small size or even a mid size has difficulty to plan an investment in a country in which he has no idea when there will be the conclusion of a process. So instead of having, let's say, an obligation to go in all countries, that will be even more problematic because people will not afford this. We have probably to make some kind of predictability. At least somebody knows that up to a point can invest, and after a point is coming to a conclusion, right or wrong, but at least it's predictable. The complexity of all our system, again, on the market access point of view, to try to go towards a kind of simplification of our processes as much as possible. Because for small company or mid-sized company, the complexity is a cost. And so if you can reduce this cost, you can turn this cost towards investments. And coming to investment, I'm sorry, but going back to the incentives. So the point of signaling at least a message from Europe cannot be the one that we are awakening investment, but it should be the one that we are enhancing the investment, or the protection or the incentive. And this will automatically, as we said, somebody very clearly, probably leverage on the great resources that in Europe are existing. I'm speaking about university, I'm speaking about center of excellence in the medical field, I'm speaking about, excellent level of general scientific knowledge coming from a long tradition, by the way. So this is something that is there. We have to be very careful that we are not losing this, protecting our talent to stay in Europe instead of looking what they need. So meaning possibility to do their job in other part of the world. This, I think, should be the major part. And for the small and middle-sized company, these references are probably even more important than for the bigger one.
Thank you, Enrico. I agree with you, and I think from all of you, we had a few essential points that we hope the Commission and the institutions will prioritize as part of the life science sector: regulatory simplification, predictability, and strong incentives, exploiting our excellency, among others. And another point that I'd like to mention, and that we have also highlighted in our letter, is political attention for rare diseases, ideally with a rare disease framework that is holistic and comprehensive and tries to tackle in this way the challenges that affect this kind of people that live with these diseases, but also the companies that try to address the existing issue. So this is another call that I would make on my side, and I think all of you agree to the policymakers. So moving towards the conclusion, it was a very interesting exchange, and I would like to thank you again for being here. And I'd like to ask you your key takeaway. What is the key message that you want our listeners and the institutions that we will discuss with to bring with them at the end of this podcast? Let me start with Enrico as I continue with you.
Yeah, Stefano, absolutely endorse what are you saying about the need of a rare disease action plan coordinated between all the policymakers and all the players, all the stakeholders in this respect. This is crystal clear. To me, as a final point, I would say the need of collaboration between all the players that was mentioned before by Alex, for instance, on the regulatory authorities, is fundamental, because this creates automatically some kind of easier the way, and so basically, let's say, more efficient allocation of resources. But again, the point, going back to the beginning, let's consider that we cannot import innovation. The innovation should be something that has to be developed over here. The innovation is the only real solution for possible healthcare challenge in the future, is the only thing that protect us even in case of emergency, and I know what I'm talking about. Innovation is the only thing that allow us to employ talent and to keep the talent where they should be, so in their own countries, and developing and making their job in our area. And even innovation is the only thing that can give hopes to the people that are affected with rare disease, or even not rare disease, nowadays in Europe. So to me, the matter is to try to have a comprehensive perspective, trying to align the society and even mobilize the society overall, being policy maker, stakeholder of any kind, medical, university, or or center of excellence, companies for sure, everybody taking their own part, but this should be a kind of joint effort in that sense. Because indeed, here we are discussing about general prosperity of our continent. And I think we have not so much time to protect this.
Thanks, Enrico. Ton, what is your view and your key takeaway?
Yeah, Stefano, if you allow me, I have 3 short points. I think the first one is the need to establish this EU Life Science Office as part of the European Life Science Strategy. I think that's the first one. Secondly, I want to come back to the importance of predictability. Predictability in early stage decision making on these critical incentives that we need, that Enrico talked about, Alexander talked about, regulatory data protection, orphan market exclusivity. We need predictability on those. And then last but not least, I want to join you, Stefano, in your call to, and we're approaching Rare Disease Day now very fastly, the need for this European Rare Disease Framework and action plan. I fully endorse that.
Thanks, Don. Very short and clear. And last but not least, Alexander, also to conclude on EUCOPE's side.
Yeah, I think Toon mentioned before, raising our ambitions is key. I think this is really that sets a direction of travel, I think, for the new Commission and the new Parliament. We need to raise our ambitions. I think we should also recognize that simplification can be part of an industry policy. We not always have to bring in more obligations and more obligations. Sometimes it's also about simplification, and we mentioned it, cutting red tape. I think this is what we see happening in other countries like the US these days, in some parts. And last but not least, we need to talk more about pricing and reimbursement. We need to look into countries which do it very well, that there is a quick access, and we need to benchmark those countries and talk to the other countries which have a poor level of access. Sometimes that's very difficult because the GDP per capita is very different in European countries. We know that, but we need to start that discussion. What is the right benchmarking in early access programs, the right benchmarking in health technology assessments, and ultimately in pricing and access decisions? And that is potentially something the European Commission could do and facilitate that discussion. So all the ideas which I heard from Toon and Enrico are very much welcome and endorsed from our end, and appreciate your time. Thanks very much for that.
Yes, thank you. And I think this was really an insightful discussion and very dynamic. We discussed not only the letter that EUCOPE sent, but key aspects that are needed as part of the revision of the general pharmaceutical legislation and beyond, what is needed in the future to make the EU more competitive and to ensure that companies can continue to thrive in the EU, including in the rare disease field. And this, at the end of the day, will be beneficial not only for the pharmaceutical and healthcare sectors, but especially for citizens and for patients. So these are our key messages. And thank you, Enrico, Ton, and Alexander, for joining this podcast and sharing your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
For our listeners, thank you for joining this episode. If you want to read the letter, visit eucope.org and stay tuned for more discussions on the evolving European healthcare and pharmaceutical landscape. And that's it for this episode of Sounds of Science, the podcast that keeps you acquainted with the most pressing policy files in the world of European life sciences. Let us know your thoughts on this podcast and your comments, and share with us any other topics you would like us to deep dive in future episodes of Sounds of Science. We are EUCOPE, the trade association for small and mid-sized innovative companies working on the field of health technology. This is Stefano Romanelli, who greets you and waits you for the next episode. In the meantime, stay updated with our work by engaging with us on social media or visiting our website.